Infamous red couches. And you know what that means? You may not know what it means.
Puppets?
But Paragana. Even better than puppets. So I've got my
true.
buddy, my good buddy,
Thanks, bro.
geostrategic thinker, all the way from Singapore, here because tomorrow his new book is coming out. His latest, The Future is Asian by Parag Khanna. Break into it, but before you do, we're going to give you a little bit of a heads up. I'm going to talk about Asia with this fine gentleman. So this is not Kishore Mahbubani reprised.
No.
Right?
You know, he's a great friend. You know, I've known him for decades at this point, and obviously he's a colleague and a neighbor in Singapore. And you know, quite frankly, he's been right on a lot of things. But the proper definition of Asia extends far beyond the Sinosphere or just the kind of Pacific Rim that he and many other people
He's
who
a little
write
bit the
about
future is
Asia,
China.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing. So, or in some ways, the present feels like China.
Mm-hmm.
The purpose of this book is twofold. A, it's that the future is Asian, not just Chinese. And to point out that Asia is much, much bigger than just East Asia. So remember that Asia, the geographic Asia and the demographic Asia, is nearly 5 billion people. You heard that right, 5 billion people.
About 3 of which is China and India.
Well,
Split
right, no,
evenly,
but
yeah.
let's not lump them together. After all, they're different civilizations. But my point is
Yes.
only 1.5 billion are Chinese. Ergo, 3.5 billion are not Chinese.
Are not yet Chinese.
So okay, that is not a rejoinder I've heard yet.
Right.
That's a good
There
one,
you go.
actually. They're
Okay.
not. So here's the thing, though. If you look at the history, let's get wonky for like 30 seconds.
Yeah.
The history of Asia, we're talking about 4,000 years, has almost always been multipolar, not unipolar, and certainly not Chinese. Only the Mongols, right? No bonus points if you understood that was the main empire that created a unipolar system in Asia. It didn't happen before, hasn't happened since, won't happen again, is kind of the point of this book. The thing is that when we talk
it's
about...
inconceivable to think about a unipolar world
Right.
in the foreseeable
Exactly.
future.
So not only is the world not going to be unipolar again, not even Asia. And this is where I part company with pretty much the last 20 years of books about Asia, because they're pretty much only about China, with 2 pages given
Where
to
30
everyone
years
else.
ago, there was a
Right.
lot of focus about the rise of China and India and other emerging markets.
Or like sort of Japan and then maybe China, or Japan and China and India still wasn't important. But here, this is exactly the point. We can now name not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 or 5 significant Asian powers, some that are yet to achieve their potential. Therefore, is the future of Asia unipolar or multipolar? Multipolar. Hence, again, the Asian system, and that's really the subject of this book, is what I call the system. A system is more than one country. A system is a set of countries that have intense interactions with each other that are more important than their relations with the rest of the world. So Europe, in many ways, has become a system, obviously, right? Proximity, density of ties, and so forth. If you think about Asia, and you look at the trade volumes, Asians, including China, and just to point out, I mean, this is not a book that's anti-China or against China or minimizing China. China represents in this book what it represents in Asia, which is about 40% of the book, because it's about 45% of the GDP, about 30% of the population, about half the outbound FDI, and about less than half the inbound FDI. So there's plenty of China in here, but it's not only China.
And yet, if I were going to make one sort of rejoinder, you'd say about 90% of the really cool new developments in technology.
Yes and no. Let's come back to that, though. But
Okay.
the system, again, is this set of countries that have intense interactions. And when you think about it from the standpoint of the trade war, this is where significant intellectual, conceptual, and factual errors have been made. Because Asians, including China, trade much more with each other, as you know, and this has been true for 10 years, much more with each other than they do with others.
Unlike Africa, where virtually no trade happening amongst
Right.
African states. It's
Right.
all
Yeah.
the sort of neo-colonial,
Yeah.
let's get commodities
Right.
out. But Asia is actually
Yes,
a system.
because they have
like Europe
complementary.
is a system.
They have very complementary economies.
Yep.
They have industrial centers, financial market centers, commodity centers, and they're therefore increasing their trade volumes and investment volumes and diplomatic interactions and everything from the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership to the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, blah, blah, blah.
And
The
most
point
of the
is,
Belt and Road investments are in
Asia.
Yeah.
So let's say you're sitting in Beijing and Donald Trump has just launched a trade war against you.
Yeah.
And he says, we are China's most significant trading relationship. We have all the leverage. Time out. No, you don't. China's #1 trading partners, not single country, but are its neighbors as a regional system, right? That's the majority of its trade.
Yep.
Number two is Europe, right? China trades a lot more with Europe, and
As a
Asia
whole.
trades a lot more with
As a
Europe.
whole,
I mean, the
right.
European Union as a trading
Yes, as a
entity.
trading unit, yes.
So America is third most important.
If you think of it that
for
way,
China.
yes.
That is the way to think of it.
No, as opposed to an individual country, I mean, but,
But
yes, I
that's
get
not
it.
what economics is
That's
about.
it. That
But
is the case.
lo and behold, in the Trump administration, you don't have people who really know economics all that well, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Nor do they know geopolitics, which is why you and I are talking about it rather than taking cues from them. So now let's get to the technology.
We would still be talking about it.
We would.
We would still, yeah.
Let's talk about the technology point that you raised, because when you think about it from the standpoint of a system, you realize that part of the reason China became China over the last 40 years is because of the heavy volumes of foreign investment that began from Japan, from South Korea, from the tiger economies and Japan investing in China, helping it move up the value chain. And they still fear China moving up the value chain, just as we do and everyone does in certain technology categories. But Japan's and South Korea's response to that reality of Chinese self-sufficiency and technological advancement is not to launch a trade war. It's not to impose export controls. It's actually to try and eat our lunch, right? It's that they want to go into the Chinese market and substitute. So if Qualcomm and Intel and NVIDIA and these companies are not going to be able to sell chips and semiconductors, microprocessors into China because of the Trump administration's political actions, they will. So
But the
mistake,
Japanese, right, are taking the same stance on Huawei that the Americans are right
Yeah,
now.
Huawei, that's one thing. But Japan also has a self-interest in doing so because they also can't have 5G and they can export 5G and they want to compete in those markets. This is not just about technological theft. This is about commercial competition. It's saying, how long can we forestall Huawei? How long can we keep them below 30% of global market share in telecommunication systems so that we ramp up?
But
and
my
compete?
question, right, around this on the tech side, because I find compelling the idea that Asia is not just the most important region globally for all of the reasons you mentioned, but also is fundamentally multipolar as a region.
Right.
With the exception of China on tech, because it seems to me that Asia does not feel multipolar technologically right now, and doesn't feel like it's moving in that direction.
I think there's confusion between the fact that China has substantial and very worthy technological advancements married with a very large domestic market size, and the notion, and this is where I think the conflation is false and the logical sort of, the sort of flow of the argument from there is inaccurate, is that therefore it will dominate the rest of Asia because countries have choice. They don't have to necessarily go with Huawei if they don't want to, right?
But they don't have an Asian choice.
That's not necessarily true. I mean, if you look again at Japanese technology, Korean technology, they're all over the place. And the thing is that what we extrapolate far too often from today in this linear fashion. So Belt and Road, China's building power grids and pipelines. It will own them. It's going to own the country. China's deploying 5G. It's going to own the country.
Port. That's right.
This is the point. This is what connectography was all about. Infrastructure is a different category of public good. You can't expropriate it necessarily once you've given it to a country. In that sense, Belt and Road,
Where data and surveillance is a little different.
Well, this thing is, so you could export. Here's the thing: it's not a flat world of similarly homogenous authoritarian regimes and docile societies, right? So you can export surveillance technology and social credit system to a country like Pakistan. Do you really think that means that it's going to cease to be a sort of vibrant country with a very with a I don't want to say a liberal culture, but certainly a free-speaking culture, and one where it's going to sort of degenerate into one where suddenly you've imported Xi Jinping and the Communist Party and they dictate everything? That's just not the way it works.
It's an interesting question. I guess I would ask you, given what's in the West, we know that liberal democracies over the last 20 years have largely eroded, and not just at the edges. And I guess the question would be, do you believe that the neo-colonial model in Asia is over because of globalization and trade, or do you believe that actually it is increasingly exportable given technology trends?
I do not think so. I think that, again, this is where it comes back to looking at Asia from the Asian point of view and Asian history. Again, multipolarity, right? The mutual unintelligibility of Asian civilizations. You can't just import China into India, right? It doesn't work that way. These countries have their own rich, deep histories. They also have, again, large endogenous technology markets. India does too. It's no slouch, right? They're the ones who have now national ID system and all of these kinds of things that they're doing in India. They don't need Chinese technology per se. So that's why they're also rethinking how they're going to deal with Huawei, for example. So to me, the landscape remains multipolar, irrespective of certain Chinese technological advances. And again, the neo-colonialism, this term, is wholly inappropriate. I don't mean it from a moral standpoint. We put that to the side.
No,
It's
analytically.
it's just a bad analogy. When I say Belt and Road, you say British East India Company. That's the way the rhetoric, the discourse is today.
There is some of that, yeah.
And I go into detail in this book about how wrong it is. A, because today you have sovereignty, you have democracy, you have transparency, you have scrutiny over everything China does, everywhere it does it. I landed at Islamabad airport recently, and there's a whole desk where Chinese have to go and sort of register. And it's not just because they're VIPs. It's kind of like for their own protection, right? Now, if you were a British colonial officer, you didn't have to worry about this. And when you were marching across Africa with your rifles, in the European empires in the 18th, 19th centuries, they didn't exactly have to listen to locals. Locals didn't have a voice. Locals didn't get to say no. Locals didn't rip up Chinese infrastructure projects like the Malaysians have done.
They didn't completely.
They didn't give.
I mean, they've said that they're going to actually move back, and now they're, of course, recognizing that would be a stupid move, and they're trying to find a way to continue to make these infrastructure projects work.
The point is, can China get away with what the British East India Company got away with? Let's say
It's an
Hambantota
interesting
Port.
question. That's Sri Lanka.
Okay,
That's right, a
so-
big one.
No, but this is my
This is
favorite.
what people talk
This
about.
is the
So
seminal one,
so
right?
do that. Let's go through that port.
So after Hambantota Port happened,
Yeah.
right? Everyone in
And this is a port that the
right.
Chinese invested in.
Right.
They weren't able to pay
Lent
off
to
their
the-
loans,
exactly.
and so now they've basically taken equity.
They've gotten a
ownership.
debt for equity swap,
Right.
99-year lease over Hambantota Port. So the next day, every newspaper in the world, or in the Western
And this
world,
is the most important port in Sri Lanka, yes?
well, it's certainly not the most used port.
No,
as
but it's the
we
most
know.
significant strategically.
Again, how significant is it strategically if the Chinese can't actually dock the submarines there the
Yeah.
way they had planned? And this is part of the story, because we paint this linear trajectory from the one debt equity swap in Sri Lanka to falling dominoes all across Asia and the Indian Ocean rim, and every country is going to be ensnared in a
Talk about Sri
Chinese
Lanka.
debt trap.
Use the Sri Lanka example.
The next day,
Yeah.
both Sri Lanka and every other country in the world had their cabinets meet and say, how do we avoid becoming the next Sri Lanka? And even Sri Lanka said, how do we avoid having to suffer and succumb to this fate? So if over Christmas, of course, if everyone was traveling on a holiday, you can be forgiven for missing this. But there was an attempted coup, right, in Sri Lanka. Rajapaksa, the sleazy president who had signed all these
With the
deals,
Chinese, right.
tried to gain power again, and he failed to do so. Now, even if he had, let's be clear, it doesn't mean that he is China's guy and therefore they get to do whatever they want. Because like I said, this is a world of sovereignty, of democracy, of scrutiny, transparency. In Sri Lanka today, everyone's watching with a microscope to see. They're probably flying drones on rotation to make sure that no Chinese vessels are docking at the port, not having been declared publicly that they're doing so. In other words, they don't really get to use the port much, is the punchline of the story. But again, more importantly,
You believe that's true. You believe over time the it's not going to be like Piraeus in Greece.
my point is there are countries way more important than Sri Lanka, right? Like Pakistan and others. In Pakistan, they've cut the value of the China-Pakistan economic corridor by more than half, right? If China really wanted them to absorb $60 billion worth of projects, they would make them do it. But this is not a
the
neo-colonial
Chinese have
world.
been deeply skeptical of the ability of the Pakistanis to get this stuff done.
Yes.
There's been a lot of questions. So if my understanding is correct, the Chinese were the ones that initially actually pulled back on
both.
the investments in Pakistan.
It's both. There's been a rebalancing of what the priorities are. There's been concerns on China's side that the Pakistanis can't necessarily deliver. They've been denying them the kinds of bailouts that they need right now to help shore up their currency. Again,
But your
the
message
fact
here
is,
seems to be that Asia more important, but China actually considerably less important than the overarching media coverage / dominance that they get in the U.S.
But that would assume that it's sort of like either or, like China versus, right? But the way Asian economic history, by which I mean the present, actually works, is that it's much more mutually reinforcing than competitive. And I give the example of the last 70 years. why, again, how did the Asian economic miracle happen? It started with Japan in the post-war years. Japan inspired the Tigers. Japan and the Tigers invested in China. And now Japan, the Tigers, and China are investing in South and Southeast Asia and Central Asia, right? They're mutually reinforcing waves. It's not zero sum. Belt and Road is the result, right, of savings countries, surplus economies, countries with obviously excess capacity like
question
China
for you on this,
helping.
which is really interesting to me. So on the one hand, you have the Japanese, and I think quite surprising to a lot of people in the West, a fairly hawkish Prime Minister Abe,
Right.
meeting with the Chinese and saying, we want to do a whole bunch of deals with you
Right.
together in
Right.
Belt and Road.
Yeah.
We'll provide better management. You guys are doing a lot of the money,
Right.
and that's going to work. Sounds interesting, right? On the other hand, you have an increasingly assertive Abe talking about how he's going to build his military in ways that the Chinese clearly are going to find
Right.
unacceptable. How do you think about those two things together?
This is the jujitsu, right? This is how Asians do geopolitical jujitsu. On the one hand, you engage, you cooperate where it's necessary, but you also stand up and defend your turf. And that's India as well. India is accepting record volumes of foreign investment from China right now. China invests more in India than in Pakistan. It invests more in its rival than in its client. Let's be absolutely clear.
A lot bigger market, but
Right.
absolutely. Yeah.
But that's one of the reasons. Again, and that's also as part of explaining the pullback out of, not the pullback out of Pakistan, but the caution. It's that they also want to make money. This is not really just about endlessly subsidizing some neo-colonial project. It's about where is the market, right? So they also
the Chinese aren't
follow
thinking
that.
about the next forever war in Iraq, for example. They're just not.
They don't have to
considering
worry
that.
about that, right?
Right.
Because they're not going to let themselves, well, potentially get caught up in that. But point being that the Chinese are investing in these different, in India, in Pakistan, all over the region. Japan and China, as we said at the beginning, they're liberalizing their trade in technology precisely to substitute for U.S. suppliers right now. So it serves their interests to collaborate further and deepen their integration. SoftBank has massive investments in China, as you well know, like Alibaba being just one of them. And yet, at the same time, you can have this geopolitical standoff. And this is what Asians have been doing well for 30 years, Ian, since the end of the Cold War. Asians have been able to keep their geopolitical rivalry and their geoeconomic integration on parallel tracks, right? And they've been able to use one in that classic sense of interdependence and, and diminishing the incentives for conflict because of economic benefits. That is still working in Asia. Otherwise, World War III would have broken out by now.
Given where the
right?
South China Sea is. And you
Yeah.
see that playing out with China-Philippines relations,
Yeah.
China, even Vietnam relations to a degree, absolutely. Look, so one other question before I'm going to turn to our audience and get some live questions from all of you. If you haven't asked them, feel free to put them down and I'll throw to you momentarily. When we think about systems, of course, you mentioned Europe as a system.
Right.
Europe is a system that is fairly highly integrated, though becoming somewhat less so.
Yeah.
Pretty cooperative, political and economic systems that are actually quite aligned,
Yeah.
right? And so there's a deep capacity for integration.
Right.
When you think about ASEAN, for example,
Yeah.
People have always been deeply skeptical
Yeah.
of ASEAN's ability to engage, not just because they've got security differences, and let's face it, Greece and Turkey have security differences, but also because the systems are so radically different.
Yeah.
There is such a great focus on local sovereignty, hands off of that you can't do much real integration.
Right.
So how should Westerners
Right.
who historically think about international integration as being that model,
Right.
how do they need to change when they think about the Asian system?
Right. Great question. Because again, we have that bias, that Eurocentric bias, where to us integration equals a teleological evolution towards a supranational governance and something like the European Union. You will never have that in Asia.
There will never be.
Look at the diversity. It's the most diverse region of the planet, right? You have, again, mutually unintelligible civilizations. It's not about integration. It's about complementarities, right? And that is more than sufficient for Asians to enjoy each other's company at arm's length and to say, you've got the food, I've got the oil, you've got the money, I've got the industry, you've got the old people, I've got the young people, right? You've got the tech, I've got the market. That's Asian integration. That's the most it will probably ever be. And that's what the Silk Road eras were like 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago. And that's what they've recreated today. And just to be clear, they've already recreated it. We talk about this term, New Silk Roads and Belt and Road, as if it was born yesterday. But for me, this story is at least 30 years old that this has been going on. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, that's when China began all of these infrastructure projects in Central Asia. You and I met in Kazakhstan,
That's
right? You know, like 20 years ago.
20 years ago.
And already we saw lots of this activity, right? So it's not the measurement, the yardstick of whether or not Asians are integrated is not, do they have a Brussels with a zillion bureaucrats wasting billions of dollars, right? That's not what Asian integration looks like. Do they have a common currency and a single capital?
What's the thing,
They're not going to have
what's
that.
the thing that if it happens over the next few years, the most likely thing that makes you think that, this Asian system idea is not working as well as I thought it was going to? What's the single tail risk that could happen?
You might be suggesting, that conflict invalidates the idea of a system, but it's in the definition of a system is that in fact you have such intense relations with each other that there can be a lot of friction. There can be conflict,
but not boom.
When India and China seem to be different, continents practically, culturally and geographically, with populations isolated from each other, with deserts and mountains between them. They weren't a system. Now they are a system. So in other words, war, if you have a war, it's proof that you have a system, right? It doesn't invalidate the system. Is not a normative
what would
concept.
invalidate this idea?
If China were to suddenly trade more with America than it does with its neighbors or with Europe. But in fact, that's not what's happening. Instead, we're seeing the opposite. Look at not only how Japan and South Korea are responding to the trade war, but Europe. Europe wants to eat America's lunch too, right? I mean, Airbus is saying, this is great. Let's have Boeing cut out of the Chinese market and have fewer Boeing aircraft bought, right? The Europeans, do you think that our news reports on the fact that European diplomats and business people are flying by the plane load right now? They're moving forward with an FTA with Japan. They want one with the ASEAN. They want one with India. And they also, like America, want to open up China all at the same time. So there's no question that 5 years from now, European trade with Asia will be on the order of $2 trillion a year, and American trade with Asia will be less than $1 trillion a year. And European trade with America will only be $1 trillion a year. So this is about the Eurasian system.
Yeah, sure.
As much as
I get that. I still, the thing that I am most skeptical about personally in this entire piece is because I find the economic arguments of integration very compelling. I think the ideas, I personally believe that the US and China emerging as technology superpowers way ahead of any other country is a serious mitigating factor in that. No, I do believe that that's going to create a lot more gravity and force countries in Asia to make choices that otherwise the Asian system of geography and interdependency and growing trade would make them not want to do.
That's a hypothetical because, quite frankly, if you believe in A, markets, and B, the law of technology diffusion, which is more powerful than any superpower, right? I mean, technology spreads. There's AI blossoming all over the world, AI as a service. AI in India, Google and others are investing so much in India to raise the next generation of those AI companies. And that means they're going to go out on the market, and Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan or Thailand, when they want to have an AI system, they don't have to go with the hegemonic Chinese.
Technology diffuses in interesting ways, right? I mean, gatekeepers matter. And gatekeepers can be individuals, but they can also be national. There's a reason why social inequality has grown in a lot of countries, even though technology should be available to everyone. And it's because gatekeepers matter. So here I see two potential gatekeepers that have really strong interests in keeping themselves as the gatekeepers. I just think that's interesting.
But but it's just another one of those cases where we're always looking at it from the standpoint from the top-down standpoint of the superpowers, and not from the bottom-up standpoint.
I'm saying that I think in the world of understanding political science, one of the most important questions is what things are more top-down and what things are more bottom-up. And I am prepared to cede to you that many of the core issues of social and cultural engagement and economic trends are actually more bottom-up than are appreciated. I think technology used to be that way, and I think is increasingly not. Now that may change, but right now technology has become much more winner-take-all for a small group of governments and institutions, and I don't think that. I think that should be integrated.
But so where's the evidence? Because if you look at South Asia, let's take India again, 1.5 billion people there. If you look at Southeast Asia, 700 million people. There's lots of Chinese money in Southeast Asia, and people talk about Southeast Asia as one of those core regions where countries are going to have to make a choice. We hear this term all the time. They're going to have to make a choice. Really? I live there. I don't see countries making a choice between America and China. I see them taking Chinese money, but I also see them taking lots of American investment, and I see them doing lots of both,
Yes,
and I
yes.
see lots of co-investment, and then I see lots of unicorns coming up
Economically.
who refuse to make a choice.
I agree. I think economically, the bottom-up argument holds a lot more.
Right.
I think technologically, it doesn't. I think there's a reason why Apple just had a really bad quarter because of China, and it's not just because the Chinese market has slipped. I think there's a reason why Google and Facebook, even though they're doing business all over the world, and Facebook just had their 15th anniversary, and they're showing all this cash, they're nowhere in China.
Yeah.
But that's not bottom-up. They should be.
Right.
They're just not. And I think that a lot of countries are going to have to make choices about those companies. And I think that's really interesting.
One of the central things that those companies have gotten right is because they were frozen out of China, they've actually been focused so much on the rest of Asia.
That's true.
Right?
Yeah.
And so if you look at Google, Facebook, LinkedIn,
They're
Twitter,
making a lot of money
their
in
offices
India and
in
Indonesia are big.
are doubling in
That's
size
right.
practically every
That's
year.
right, and they're focusing more
They're
on
getting
those
their
things.
eggs out of the China
We're going
basket.
to ask you some
Let's do
questions
it.
coming from here. So here's a good one. Thomas Richter wants to know, what are the biggest stories in Asia that we are missing by our strong focus on China?
Well, so the Southeast Asian region, ASEAN, gets more FDI every year than China does. It is the next, I don't want to say the new factory floor, as if China is not a factory floor, because China still is based on its labor automation and its output of industrial goods, irrespective of how much labor is
Southeast
human
Asia
labor.
gets more foreign direct investment than China.
Yeah, and by the
right
way,
now.
in 2018, because we just got the data, India got more foreign investment than China. So the two other regions of Asia that we ignore, both of them get more FDI than China
this is a
does.
good time for the Americans to actually launch a trade war against China.
No, it's
as
just
long
a
as
good
we were
time
to do like
for
TPP and other multilateral
Yeah, it's a
stuff.
good time for America to join TPP.
Yes.
It's not necessarily whether or not you launch a trade war. See, the thing is that people need to understand the relationship between like trade, investment, and supply chains. I mean, if you don't join TPP, or you think that you're freezing Chinese out of your market, the Chinese just shift their
That's pretty clear,
production into countries that can export to the U.S.
Okay, so Raja Sutherland, who is the next Asian tiger in your view?
Ooh, that's a good one. Well, yeah, new tigers, people talk about, Bangladesh and Indonesia and so forth. These are highly populous countries.
Yeah.
They're democracies, by the way, anywhere from 200 to 300 million people. They have crazy growth rates. Bangladesh is one of the world's 3 or 4 fastest growing economies. There are governments that have
Massive
been
climate concerns.
there's that. But they've been basket case economies and obviously highly corrupt. But now you have governments that are saying, you know what, we need to bootstrap, get our act together. So there's a lot of, again, this is the point of the book, is that you've got Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia. That's right there is 1 billion people practically, right? Just 3 countries, and they're growing like gangbusters. So if you wanted to pick who were the next tigers, you'd obviously pick at least those 3. Philippines too.
Where does Russia fit into this? Tanya Kim wants to know. Would it be a friend or foe to the Asian market region?
Aha! It is very much part of the Asian system. It's becoming a part. So, of course, Russia thinks of itself as Eurasian power,
and
of course,
investment levels into Russia are not so high.
no, and geographically it is. But is it a major resource provider for Asia? Absolutely. China has now surpassed Germany as largest trading partner, for example. That's a big shift, by the way. As you know, all of these vectors started to cross at around the same time as Russia invaded Ukraine and Crimea, and the relations went cold and sanctions were imposed from the West. As you well know, as far as India and China and even Japan are concerned, it's all about growing your trade with Russia, because you need their food, you need their energy, and so on and so forth. So, and Belt and Road, of course, you want to be a conduit. You know that Japan has just started doing trains via China, partnering with China. So another example of we talk about Sino-Japanese rivalry. Well, okay, meanwhile, Japan's largest logistics company is working with Chinese rail operators to ship their goods to Europe, because they're going to have an FTA with Europe, and this requires going across Russia. So this is how it really works, right? Never mind the headlines about the rivalries.
So let's see. Rick Otten wants to know, what about FDI from Asia towards Europe? What is the future?
So, it's been steady, and then when China came along in about 10 years ago, it really spiked because China wanted to buy everything from the Piraeus port of Greece to German robotics companies. But then it fell back down again recently because Germany woke up and said, "Wait a minute, we're not going to sell the family silver." And then, of course, they've started investment screening processes just like we have. So it's going to be volatile, but again, there's still a very strong mutual interest because there's European companies that want to be further capitalized, and they want Asian money to help them move back into Asia because they see that as a big export destination. So you can't really, it's hard to disentangle trade and investment, but generally speaking, Europeans who I talk to are still keen on, they're suspicious of China, but they're not averse to Asian money.
So Steve Lodegat wants to know if China will support proxy forces in the developing world in the 21st century.
If it suits its own interest, let's do this world in 60-second style. Yes, but of course. So as we know, they're already using private military companies. They're protecting oil installations and so forth. But here's the interesting thing: if you look at Africa, right? Some people wrongly still claim that China's colonizing Africa and so on. Okay, not quite, because all of their foreign investment goes in about 5 countries, and when they lose interest in a country's commodities because they're no longer using those raw materials,
A lot less money.
They just abandon it,
Yeah.
right? Because they don't want to be a global colonist.
Too, obviously.
Okay, but
the commodities are the biggest.
A couple
driver,
years ago, we were talking about China is definitely going to extend a massive loan to Congo, right? A couple of years later, it's like, oh, actually, the Chinese don't need Congolese cobalt that much anymore because every Chinese person already has 2 mobile handsets, so they're just going to walk away from Congo. Angola. We used to hear about the Chinese basketball league in Angola. Well, there's no more Chinese basketball league, to my knowledge, in Angola because there are not that many Chinese people anymore, or oil workers.
There are many tall Angolans, so that seems wrong.
Okay, so
me.
they're sponsored by Chinese companies who have now left, so those contracts are going to expire. I think they need to start playing for other teams.
Yeah, that sounds right. Let's see, we have Rick Otten already read the book. I don't know how he got it. Says it's fascinating. That's good to know. Last question here, and I think it's a good one because we haven't really talked about climate yet. And
right.
A few people are asking about climate, but this is the best of them, I think. Anish Tiwari asking, how sustainable do you think Asian growth is, given the fact that most of the resources are overstretched with air pollution, drinking water being a few among many concerns? I mean, certainly when you think about, sort of arability concerns, right? Of land, potability of water. Look at where storms are going. Look at where floods are going. I mean, the Asians have this extraordinary human capital, but also massive vulnerability that they have underspent on.
Right. I don't ignore that. I mean, I've in previous work, I've been mapping out the vulnerability of Asian populations. 5 billion people who are very exposed to everything from tsunamis to droughts, rising sea levels and desertification, you name it, flooding. Obviously, then all the man-made catastrophes. Yes, it is man-made, Donald Trump, in terms of all the pollution and so forth. So, the breakneck growth has had significant costs. Countries, you see those like China that have that strong capacity and will are trying to change. The air in Beijing, each time you go, is more normal, if you will, whereas in India it's getting worse.
It's getting much worse, yeah.
And then it'll get better again at some point, right, depending on how they structure their economies. India is, again, doesn't get enough attention for what it's trying to do for alternative energy. But that said, if you presume...
Because there's still like 75% of electricity is coal for India
right
now.
Exactly. Wood, other stuff, right? But again, there's so much that they're doing with biomass and alternative and so forth. So they're working very hard at the solar too. But you can imagine a scenario where if climate change, global warming is already baked in, right? And if sea level rises are not going to be reversed, right? It's going to be very problematic for the massive coastal Asian populations, which is like most of the world population is like coastal Asians, right? So I deal with that head on in the sense that, again, it's also the geography where you have the most infrastructure investment, but they're building these more and more downtown business districts on the coast. So they're going to have to invest a lot more in resilient, obviously, infrastructure that's going to push people further inland. I mean, like Miami, but Jakarta, right? I mean, you're going to have to move inward. But it's interesting because it's one of the scenarios I've been looking at for like 10 years or more is what about Inner Asia, Central Asia, Siberia, these areas that are already thawing, that are becoming bread baskets for the world that have no people. You can imagine
They don't have high soil quality, though. I mean, the ability to really
they're
grow
working
on
it.
them is
Yeah,
radically
yeah,
different than
yeah.
what you'd have
So,
in
you
the
know,
bread belt.
wheat, yes, but other crops, no. But I have a map that shows kind of the growing food production, food trade within Asia. And look, this is obviously a very fickle area to exactly geolocate, you know, fertile areas. It's changing a lot with the climate and because of technology as well, where a lot more can be done with a lot less. So, and Asians are investing significantly in those technologies to be able to do crop production with less water-intensive irrigation and all this kind of stuff. So, again, we have global markets for commodities, right?
Yeah.
So they don't have to be self-sufficient in food. They're obviously not. Look at soybeans, right? I mean, if it weren't for Brazilian, Argentine, and American soybeans, there'd be a lot less nutritious diet
Sure.
in Asia. But so Asians aren't going for like food self-sufficiency, but they're definitely trying to be a lot more efficient rather than
So
self-sufficient.
it sounds to me like, I mean, massive opportunities, obviously, generally underappreciated internationally for this region of the world, which we should barely even call a region because it implies it has the same level of weight as other regions when it doesn't, has more. But the tail risks around this region clearly are also larger.
I mean, again, yeah, given the size of Asia, of course, there's significant risks in every domain. Again, there are the geopolitical risks, there are the economic risks, certainly spillover effects from a slowing China, but right now other countries are actually gaining from that in some ways. They lose in some, those who are exporting heavily into China, they lose a bit, but they're gaining the investment too, right? So I don't think there's a single measure of these things. But again, generally speaking, you have such a vast region. It's a lot more resilient than people think. It's become a lot wealthier, a lot faster. And something very important, this is a central debate, they have more capacity than we think. Because people tend to be of two minds about Asia right now. They say, we see weak and fragile states and, you know, countries falling apart. I don't see that. Take it from me, who lives there, who spends every week on the road traveling in Asian countries, some rich, some poor. I see focus, I see bootstrapping, I see determination, I see pragmatism, right? I see countries not burying their heads in the sand like they did during the Asian financial crisis 20 years ago. I see governments saying, we've got to privatize, you know, need structural reforms, we've got to open to investment, we've got to increase our trade, we've got to focus on infrastructure and development and education. That's what I see everywhere in the region. So let's not underestimate them is certainly one of my central messages.
Parag Khanna well on the road to becoming Chinese within 10 years. It's very impressive. The Future is Asian is coming out tomorrow. A important book to think about and change your thinking, at least challenge your thinking about
Change
a part
your
of the
thinking,
world.
not just
challenge your thinking.
No,
Not
change.
always. We'll see.
No,
Maybe
I'm out to change minds.
Some of these people, their minds may already be just fine. But
It's
at
the Lee
very
Kuan Yew in me
least-
insists
no.
they-
It is the Lee Kuan Yew, you see. He's not even 10 years before Parag becomes fully Chinese. Good man. Congratulations.
Thanks, bro.
Good to see you.
Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thank you, everyone.
Take it easy. Be good.